Did the Germans in World War II have flying saucers? This is a story that's been out for a long time, but there is actually some CIA evidence to prove that this may have been a reality. This is a fascinating subject, so get in here. This is Jack with Cosmic Road. I talk about UFOs and the paranormal. Please hit like, please subscribe, and smash the bell to be notified of future videos. Please join me on social media. There's Facebook and Twitter links below. I'd love to see you there. And please comment below as I'm going through the story. Now, I love the story because it touches upon some other really interesting things like the Marconi murders. And we'll get to that. But there was a rash of suicides in the Marconi company and BAE. And yeah, so let's get into all of that. I'm not going to read this whole article. This is from House and Wise from a few weeks ago. But yeah, the CIA's Freedom of Information Act electronic reading room is full of peculiar documents, with many of them showcasing the agency's attempts to monitor technological advancements in other countries, particularly during and after World War II. One such document highlights the claims of renowned German engineer George Klein. According to Klein, though many people believe the flying saucers to be a post-war development, they were actually in the planning stage in German aircraft factories as early as 1941. The document references a German newspaper interview with Klein, who discussed his experimental work on flying saucers from 41 to 45. Klein said that he was an engineer in the Ministry of Speer, probably refers to Albert Speer, who in 1942 was Minister for Armaments and Ammunition for the Third Reich and was present in Prague on 14 February 1945 at the first experimental flight of a flying saucer. The report stated, the flying saucer reached an altitude of 12,400 meters within 3 minutes and a speed of 2,200 kilometers per hour. Klein emphasized that in accordance with German plans, the speed of these saucers would reach 4,000 kilometers per hour. One difficulty, according to Klein, was the problem of obtaining the materials to be used for the construction of the saucers, but even this had been solved by German engineers toward the end of 1945, and construction on the objects was scheduled to begin, Klein added. According to Klein, the Germans had already constructed 3 saucers for testing purposes by 1944. It remains unknown if these saucers were the same Foo Fighters that American pilots reported encountering. Probably not, since there were a lot of them, and as I've talked before, famous UFO researcher Wendell Stevens did a deep dive into the Foo Fighters. And he showed that the Foo Fighters were composed of all the same size and shapes of UFOs we're seeing today. They weren't simply the luminous balls of light or the spherical objects that I had associated with Foo Fighters, but there were triangles and saucers and all sorts of other things. So cigar shapes. So all the ones that we're seeing today were seen back then in World War II. So unlikely to be these 3 saucers or whatever from Germany. The document outlines the specifications of the 3 discs. One of them was a disc-shaped vehicle with a cabin inside, built to the same factories responsible for constructing the V-2 rockets. So anyway, in the final days of the war, when Germany had given up hope, the engineers at their group's station in Prague were instructed to thoroughly destroy all their plans and models before the arrival of the Soviets. So yeah, that's a story that's been out there for a long time, and there's various versions of that story, taking their technology with them to Antarctica and engaging Admiral Byrd in Operation High Jump. All that kind of material. I think the evidence for that is very interesting. It's too scanty for me to really make a determination on that. However, there is the idea that the Germans may have acquired their technology from the Mussolini UFO. And Mussolini obtained a UFO from a crash in 1933. And he got the famous scientist, physicist Marconi to work on it. And Marconi, of course, is of the Marconi Company, later on associated or merged with BAE. And there were a rash of murders in the Marconi Company in the 80s. So could the Marconi Company have obtained or kept some of the material from that crash? Who knows, but it's an intriguing speculation. Lou Elizondo and one other highly credible person has said that the Mussolini UFO was taken to the United States in 1945, which is the same year we acquired the Trinity UFO crash. And I'm sure there were others before that. But yeah, so we had two crashes in 1945. One of them was the Mussolini crash. But could the Germans have also benefited from some of this technology, from some of this material that Marconi was working on and that Mussolini himself was working on? So it's possible. And could that have something to do with the murders? It's really interesting. Dead scientist mystery baffles Britain, because the Marconi Company at that point, BAE, was in Britain. On March 30th, scientist David, he climbed into his car and he died, and a whole bunch of them died. And these guys, some of them were working on the Star Wars project. So that is interesting. Maybe it was simply Soviet spies killing them for working on the Star Wars. Possibly. Could they be using some UFO technology in their Star Wars applications? It is interesting to speculate on. However, it gets a little weirder. There are repeated reports of people, often Marconi-affiliated scientists, swerving off the road without cause. Those that survive can only say they can't recall why, and that they feel fatigued or disoriented. This man reports that he was having repeated urges to do just that. So are we talking about like this Havana syndrome kind of stuff? This is one guy's account, and Joe's version of events is perhaps the most controversial. He says he noticed unusual sounds emanating from his telephone and fixed beside the cabinet. In a lengthy document which Joe compiled about the events in India, he wrote, in an attempt to gather data out of audio effects, almost always administered while I was falling asleep, I placed a tape recorder on the bed with freshly demagnetized heads and a tape fresh out of the packet. In the morning, I played it back and was considerably alarmed to find an electronic noise on the tape impossible to describe in writing, which seemed at the time to keep pace with the sound of my breathing. As I gradually fell asleep, so the electronic noise or pulse also slowed down, always maintaining exactly the same rate as the breathing itself. So you're getting this kind of almost poltergeist-like activity, not necessarily the Havana syndrome, but something else. And the poltergeist activity is something you associate with aliens and UFOs, because alien contact or contact with the beings is often associated with paranormal events. That's, as true today as it was back then. So what does that mean? It's hard to say, but it does seem to point to something more anomalous going on than simply Soviet assassins targeting Reagan-era Star Wars scientists. And, it's impossible to know what's going on, obviously by design. But there is another wrinkle I would like to point out from the news story by George Knapp that just came out a couple of days ago, in which I've covered both in a video and in a live stream. According to the scoop from George Knapp, well, this is a story that he's been sitting on for decades. The head of Area 51, decades ago, he was one of the directors of EG&G, and which is a contractor that was overseeing Area 51. He says there was an alien body, or actually there was a live alien at one point, and it passed away. And there was also a recovered UFO. So that's interesting. But the pertinent part to me about the German connection because later, after he had, over a period of a couple of years, given the story to George Knapp, years later, he recanted his story. First, he was intimidated by the men in black, and then he recanted his story, and they forced him to change his story. And in his new version of events, it wasn't aliens in the ship at all. It was victims of Joseph Mengele. Who was Joseph Mengele? Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, a German SS officer and physician during World War II. He performed deadly experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, and it goes on. It's pretty dark, but he was a bad dude, and so now the director of EG&G was forced to say that the occupants of the flying saucer, with the live being in it, well, the live being was a victim of Joseph Mengele, and this was all a plan of the Germans to sow disinformation amongst the U.S. How likely is that? Probably not very likely. I guess it's a little bit more likely if they did have a functioning flying saucer. However, there are numerous witnesses who saw the bodies at Roswell, and at least a couple of remote viewers who were even able to connect with the beings at Roswell. And, well, there's a wealth of witness testimony and other evidence to indicate that something more anomalous happened at Roswell than simply German victims. So, again, it's hard to say for sure, and we don't even know if Roswell is the source of the crash in the story by O'Donnell, that is the director of EG&G, who was the source for George Knapp in that story. What's important, though, is that the United States government, the control group, the men in black, whoever it is, forced O'Donnell to change his story to say that it was the Germans that were doing this and not aliens. So could the government have done the same thing elsewhere? Could they have planted a false narrative that the Germans were heavily involved in the phenomenon and had their own flying saucers? Because there are so many stories about that and so many versions of that story. Germans on the moon, etc. How much of that is actually deliberate disinformation by the government? Because we know or strongly suspect they have done it once before in the case of O'Donnell, where they forced him to recant his story and then to say it was the Germans. So have they done this elsewhere? I think that probably yes, this is probably a false narrative that they trotted out upon occasion to muddy waters and to suppress interest into genuine alien and otherworldly encounters. O'Donnell's story made me greatly reconsider all the German UFO stuff that I've heard over the years. I now think of those stories in a new light as possible disinfo from the U.S. government. But what do you think, guys? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. That'd be awesome. Please smash the subscribe button and the bell to be notified of future videos. You don't want to miss a thing. Please join me on Facebook and Twitter. There's links below. And until next time, this is Jack with Cosmic Road signing out.